I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about sleep and its importance, both for dealing with your ADHD and for dealing with stress during the coronavirus. Getting a good night's sleep is the single most important thing you can do for taking care of or helping reduce ADD symptoms. And getting a good night's sleep is also probably the single most important thing you can do for decreasing stress while we're all dealing with the coronavirus crisis. I mean, we know that good sleep decreases anxiety. Sleep deprivation is actually one of the most prominent triggers for panic attacks. Poor sleep is a trigger for depressive episodes and in a nasty feedback loop. Depression is pretty effective at disrupting sleep, either causing too much sleep or too little sleep. We know that a good night's sleep measurably helps with alertness and memory, which are clearly tied in with ADHD symptoms, and that measures of emotional volatility rocket upwards if you're deprived of sleep. Several studies have suggested the impact of a complete night of sleep deprivation are as severe on some of these functions as being legally drunk. And it's strange that, all-nighters are a standard of college studying or cramming for finals. But how many people would say, hey, let's get drunk before you go into your final exam? Not too many. Depriving yourself of sleep, again, a whole night's sleep, has significant impact on lots of brain functions. Not only does total sleep deprivation have a big effect, but milder chronic versions of partial sleep deprivation also have huge and measurable impact. So most adults really do need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. And I will repeat this part again and again. It's not only the duration of sleep. It's not only that you need 7 or 8 hours. It's that you need the same 7 or 8 hours. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But that is, we know we have as much data supporting that the consistency of the timing of sleep is important as the duration of sleep. In American society, up to a third of adults are getting by with 6 or less hours of sleep, and many of them are telling themselves, I'm functioning just fine. Every single study that I know of, and there have been hundreds, have forced people who are getting that amount of sleep to sleep a whole night's worth. Shows again, improvement in anxiety symptoms, improvement in other mood symptoms, improvement in the volatility of mood, improvement in memory, improvement with ability to calculate, adding up a column of numbers or how accurately you can find the word "the" in a paragraph. So there are two main factors controlling sleep. One is a fatigue factor. So the longer it's been since you last slept, the more this factor builds up. And in humans, it seems that this factor is biochemical correlate of what's going on is that adenosine chemical builds up in your brain. How caffeine can help people stay alert as the caffeine binds to the adenosine receptors and prevents adenosine from binding there and signaling a fatigue factor. Caffeine doesn't take away the need for sleep. And an important factor with caffeine, most people who feel more alert, who feel more invigorated, who feel more energetic from caffeine feel that effect for an hour or two. But caffeine's half-life is 5, 6, 7 hours in most humans. And the half-life is the time, it's not the time to get rid of it. The half-life is the time it takes to just get rid of half of it from your system. Coffee at 7 a.m. is kind of like a half cup at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. So there's still measurable caffeine in your system at bedtime, decreasing that fatigue factor, so making it a little harder to fall asleep, whether or not you're perceiving that as so. The other big factor controlling sleep is a circadian rhythm factor. So you do have a clock in all the cells in your body. You have a central master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is strongly influenced by day-night darkness signals coming into the retina. Big peak in terms of ease of falling asleep in the late evening, which is why that's bedtime. And there's a second, it's smaller peak in that circadian rhythm. It's siesta time, early afternoon. So siesta time is not just a function of having a big meal and being sleepy because of that. Siesta time is a biological clock-driven propensity to being less alert at that time of day. And we often think that it's sort of the southern Mediterranean cultures, the Spaniards, the Italians, the Mexicans, who take a siesta break. But when I lived in Switzerland, and a German part of Switzerland in the 1980s, banks closed for 2 hours in the middle of the day, schools closed for 2 hours in the middle of the day. You were expected to go home, have a big meal with friends and family, and rest for a few hours before going back to work. So evidence that sleep particularly is important for ADHD is there's some people with sleep disruption symptoms. So there are children with obstructive sleep apnea where blockages in their airway at nighttime strongly disrupted sleep. And there have been a number of studies showing on these kids with sleep apnea, when you cured the sleep apnea, either through sort of tonsil or adenoidectomy surgeries or with CPAP devices, that actually, in that subset of kids who appeared to have a full-blown syndrome of ADHD, it completely alleviated ADHD symptoms. Now, that doesn't mean everyone with ADHD has sleep apnea, but it does show that sleep deprivation in and of itself can produce many of the symptoms of ADHD. Another line of research looking at sleep and ADHD or circadian rhythms has been looking at bright light therapy. So using the phototherapy units that are used for people who have seasonal depression, using those in people who have ADHD but no ongoing depression, dosed in the early morning after about 2 weeks, produced measurable improvement in 3 different measures of cognitive functioning without having any mood effect on those people. And there's some theoretical psychological researchers who think that a big part of the cognitive dysfunction in ADHD is desynchronization of internal rhythms. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is something that I don't hear a lot of talk about, and it's really important for sleep health. Most of us are familiar with that circadian clock, and many of us have friends who, even without an alarm clock, can wake up at 6:31 day after day after day. I mean, our circadian clock is tremendously precise and consistent, down to a minute or two in time. Within sleep, we have a sloppier clock called an ultradian rhythm. So ultra means less than a day's length. Circadian rhythms are about a day's length. So within sleep, we have a sloppy clock that's on about a 90-minute to 2-hour cycle, in which we go through slow wave sleep, non-REM sleep, then into REM sleep episodes, where REM sleep, we're doing our active dreaming, our body is paralyzed, but our brains look almost alert and as active as they are during time. And then, usually right after one of those REM periods of sleep, we have a period for a minute or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 where an expert neurologist looking at your EEG, your brain waves, cannot differentiate that period of time from being wide awake. On most normal nights, though, most of us, after a period of that, then start another of these ultradian cycles where we go back into the slow wave deep sleep and then REM sleep and then get back up about an hour and a half to 2 hours later to that wakefulness. So if you are sleeping well, if your room is dark, if there's no noise, if your bladder isn't full, if you don't have other disruptions, your subjective experience in the morning is that you've slept through 7-8 hours with no interruptions. On the other hand, if you are disturbed by any of these things, including worrying about whether you're sleeping, and you open your eyes at that period of brief wakefulness, then you're alert and you're awake, and you're aware that you're alert and you're awake. And if you look at the clock and say, oh my God, it's 2 a.m., I shouldn't be awake, then that further perpetuates staying awake, staying aroused. So for many people I've worked with, just knowing that awakening actually several times during the night for brief intervals is not aberrant, is not pathological, is not a sign that you have a sleep disorder. It's just a sign that for whatever reasons you did wake up and were alert at that time of the night. The non-REM sleep, that deep sleep, seems to be powerfully helpful for pruning and weeding out neural connections at nighttime. It seems to be essential for storing memories and strengthening memories. And not just for storing memories, but also for getting rid of things we don't need to remember. So every day we are bombarded by thousands of pieces of information, what you ate for lunch, what color desk you're looking at right now. A lot of that is useless, garbage information. And one of the things that happens in non-REM sleep is a pruning or removal of those non-essential, non-important memories. There's also parts of non-REM sleep that are important for learning, skill memory learning. So not just factual event learning, but learning how to play the guitar, learning how to ride a bicycle, learning how to use a software program for work. So REM sleep seems more important for integrating your feelings, the facts you've learned today, and sort of creating a map or an understanding the world. So REM sleep is a more complicated function. REM sleep seems to be only present in birds and mammals as far as we can tell, whereas sleeping overall is present and essential across the animal kingdom. One of the biggest findings in sleep research of the last decade, and whenever I hear this, I say, why didn't I figure this out decades earlier? This is such a simple, basic part, function of sleeping, is that more than 95% of the people who have troubles with sleeping do not have a trouble with sleep. That sounds contradictory. How can, I have insomnia, I'm awake all night. Isn't that a problem with sleep? Again, the research shows pretty convincingly that these people do not have a problem with sleep. Their sleep system is intact, it's sitting there, it's ready to go. So what's the problem? The problem is we have a competing system, an alternating system, which is our daytime activation system. And 95% of the problems with sleep are a failure to turn off, to inactivate that daytime activation system. So the problem, if you're having trouble falling asleep at the beginning of the night or falling back asleep if you awaken in the middle, isn't again the failure to sleep to come in. It's sitting waiting there. It's a failure to get rid of that daytime over-arousal. So for that reason, anything we can do to decrease that over-arousal system is going to be helpful for sleep. So we talked about some of those with, again, having a regular system, decreasing certainly light stimuli, certainly particularly in the blue end of the light spectrum, which is our circadian clocks are particularly sensitive to that end of the spectrum. And there have been studies that are reading a book with dim bedside light is considerably less disruptive to sleep than reading on a Kindle or other device if you don't have a blue blocking setting put on it. Light is getting directly into the eye. And many of our devices, again, if they don't have a special blue blocking setting on them, are letting more into the blue end of the spectrum and to disrupt circadian rhythms. So again, anything we can do to decrease daytime activation, the recommendations are sort of to relax and let sleep approach rather than trying to force sleep to come. If you're trying to force sleep to come, you are by very definition activating, arousing your system, which is what you don't want to be doing. So one of the best books on sleep is Why We Sleep. It's by Matthew Walker. He's a Berkeley sleep researcher. The book came out a couple of years ago. He spends 340 pages on sleep, and then at the end, he has his 12 recommendations for sleep. But he says, if you're going to just follow one of those, that would be remembering to stay on a regular sleep cycle. Because again, you want to be working with your circadian rhythm system and not against it. There's certainly other good things you can do, but that is the predominant, most important one. So a few of the other things that are good to keep in mind. Exercise is good during the day, and particularly during our sheltering in place, many people have been getting less of it. But even if you're marching in place, doing jumping jacks in your room or going up and down the staircase with your mask on in your apartment building, exercise is good. One thing about exercise, though, is you don't want to be doing that too late in the day, in the last hour or two before sleep, for two reasons. One is that that's helping to increase activation, which you're trying to decrease. And two, particularly if it's vigorous exercise, it can increase your core body temperature. And part of what happens, there's a circadian rhythm to body temperature that interacts with the sleep circadian rhythm. Body temperature actually starts to drop before the onset of sleep to help it make it easier to sleep. So That's why exercise too late in the day is not a good idea. Other things that are important is avoiding and minimizing caffeine, nicotine, alcohol. Again, caffeine and nicotine help with alertness during the day, but rebounding from them can have effects later at night. And alcohol, even though that also, if you drink enough, you pass out, can promote sedation. We know that the byproducts, the metabolites of alcohol in the body, disrupt the deeper stages of sleep. And even a glass of wine at lunchtime can disrupt the deeper stages of sleep later that night. So alcohol might help you fall asleep, but it's going to make you wake up more frequently and sleep less deeply. Naps can be done strategically, and a nap at siesta time may well be helpful and may be close to the most natural pattern of sleep, but probably not more than an hour, and particularly naps later in the day diminish that fatigue factor, disrupt the buildup of adenosine, so it can make it harder to fall asleep at night. A long hot shower will probably increase core body temperature and not be helpful for falling asleep, but a briefer warm shower, warm bath can cause vasodilation in our fingers, toes. When that vasodilates, we're actually losing heat more quickly and cooling down our extremities more quickly. So the cool extremities that result from a warm bath are actually what can help people fall asleep. And then another reminder that making your bedroom as dark, as quiet, and as cool as possible will lead to better sleep. And the last tip from sleep experts is, if you do wake up in the middle of the night, they would strongly recommend, and you're awake for more than several minutes, and again, they recommend not checking the clock every few minutes, because that tends to add into arousal and make it more difficult for you to fall asleep. But if you are not falling into bed after a few minutes, they would recommend getting out of bed, doing something under dim light or no light that is as boring as possible, like if they even have phone books anymore, reading a phone book, but not engaging in an activating video game or compelling blog that you read or listen to. Doing something as boring as possible, and then when you're feeling more sleepy, going back to the bed. And part of that is to train your body to expect to be sleeping when you are in bed, and not to associate tossing and turning and being awake with being in bed. Research would show pretty convincingly, even if you only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep that night, it's still good to stick with your circadian rhythm for both going to bed and waking up time. So if you only slept 4 hours, you don't get to sleep later another 4 hours, because that's disrupting your circadian rhythm and actually teaching your body, I don't have to bother sleeping at night. She's going to let me sleep for 10 hours into the day. I see there's some questions, so I'm going to take a second or two to read the questions. And if you have more that are coming in, I'll try to answer those. Jennifer is writing that she's saying she can fall asleep but not stay asleep. I have narcolepsy with insomnia, so I have times when I sleep for weeks. And then other weeks I get 1 to 3 hours at night. And I have ADHD and narcolepsy. Seems to wake up around the same time every night when I have those weeks. So I was just saying that 95% of sleep problems are failures with daytime arousal. Narcolepsy, which true narcolepsy is actually extremely uncommon condition. If Jennifer truly has full-blown narcolepsy, then that does entail some disruption of sleep processes. So some of what I say may not be valid. There can certainly be a host of other reasons for excessive daytime sleepiness and for ease in falling asleep. Most of what I was saying about minimizing arousal systems just before going to sleep and in the middle of the night if you awaken should still be true and valid. Certainly many of the ADD medications, both the stimulants and what we call the non-stimulant stimulants, modafinil, Provigil, Nuvigil, which have been FDA approved for helping with narcolepsy, help to some extent with improving daytime alertness. And if people are more alert and more active during the daytime, usually that does help with nighttime falling asleep. But particularly if there's a Sounds like patterns of weeks at a time where you're drifting in and out of different sleep cycles. It may be something more complicated than straightforward narcolepsy going on. Be safe, be sane, take care of yourself, and I will be here next week.